She was 41 years old, and she had exactly $11, a mule with a limp, and nowhere on this earth that would call her home. Her name had been struck from a family Bible by the man who once called her sister, and the reason was nothing more than a debt she never owed and a marriage she never should have trusted. What little she had left after the auction of her husband's estate fit into a single trunk, and what little money remained after 3 months of wandering fit into a tobacco tin she kept sewn into her petticoat. So when she rode into the half-dead town of Coldwater Bend, Wyoming, in the spring of 1889, and saw a crumbling, sun-bleached chapel standing empty at the edge of town, with a hand-painted sign reading, "For sale $6, any buyer," she did not laugh, though every sensible bone in her body told her she should have. She paid the $6. Folks watching from the boardwalk shook their heads at the foolishness of a woman spending her last coin on a building the town itself had given up for dead. But sealed behind the altar of that forgotten chapel was something no one in Coldwater Bend had thought to look for in 11 years, something that would not only save her, but would hand an entire town back its future. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Colcord. If you have ever stood somewhere you were told had nothing left to offer, and felt, quietly, that you were wrong, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Marguerite Colcord was born in 1848 in a small river town in Kentucky, the second daughter of a cooper named Amos Whitlock, a man whose hands were always faintly stained with the tannin of oak barrels, and whose voice, when he taught his daughters, never once rose in anger. It was Amos who taught Marguerite the trade that would follow her for the rest of her life, though neither of them could have known it then. He taught her to read wood the way other men read scripture, to run a thumb along a grain and know whether it would hold water or split under pressure, to smell a plank and know how long it had cured, to listen to the particular hollow knock of a board that hid rot beneath a handsome face. "Wood doesn't lie, Daisy," he used to tell her, using the pet name only he ever used, "but it will let a careless man believe whatever he wants to believe. That's not the wood's fault. That's his." Marguerite absorbed this, the way children absorb the things said to them, with love, not as instruction, but as truth about the shape of the world. Her mother, Ruth, was a seamstress, and a woman of fierce, quiet faith, the kind that did not announce itself with fervor, but simply persisted day after day like a lamp left burning. It was from Ruth that Marguerite learned patience with fine, exacting work, the discipline of small stitches, the willingness to undo an hour's labor rather than let a flaw stand. And it was from both her parents, together, that she learned the value they placed above nearly everything else, that a thing's worth was never determined by how it looked to a stranger passing by, but by what it was built to hold, and how faithfully it had held it. Her older sister, Cordelia, was a different creature entirely, sharp-tongued, ambitious, hungry for a kind of respectability their parents' modest cooperage could never quite supply. Where Marguerite found peace in the smell of curing oak, Cordelia found only the ceiling of her prospects, and the gap between the sisters, though never spoken aloud in those early years, was already being carved. There was a particular afternoon, one Marguerite would return to often in memory over the years that followed, when she was perhaps 11 years old, and her father allowed her to help him inspect a shipment of white oak staves delivered by a supplier new to their town. Most of the wood looked, to an untrained eye, entirely sound, pale, tightly grained, handsomely cut. But Amos walked the stack slowly, tapping each stave with 2 knuckles, listening the way another man might listen to a heartbeat, and set aside nearly a third of the shipment as unfit, over the vocal objections of the supplier, who insisted the wood was fine and the cooper was simply being difficult. Amos never raised his voice. He simply handed young Marguerite one of the rejected staves, and one of the approved ones, and told her to strike each against the workbench and listen. The rejected piece gave a dull, flat sound, faintly hollow, the telltale voice of wood that had dried too fast and cracked invisibly along its heart. The approved piece rang clean and true, "The eye can be fooled by a good plane and a coat of oil," her father told her that day, "but sound doesn't lie, and neither does weight nor grain, nor how a thing holds up under what it's asked to carry." Marguerite carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life, long after she had any barrels left to build, applying it instead to people, to promises, to the quiet architecture of trust itself. At 19, Marguerite married Thomas Colcord, a carpenter and lay minister who had come through their river town building a Methodist meeting house and stayed long enough to fall in love with the cooper's younger daughter. Thomas was a gentle man, deeply devout, given to long silences and longer prayers, and together they spent 2 decades moving from town to town across the frontier as churches rose beneath his hands in Missouri, in Kansas, in the Nebraska territories, and finally in Wyoming, where in 1878 Thomas built, plank by plank with his own 2 hands, and Marguerite's steady assistance, a small white chapel in the young settlement of Coldwater Bend. It was, by every account of those who remembered it, a beautiful little building, modest but true in its joints, the kind of structure that would stand 100 years if a single soul cared for it. Thomas often said the chapel was his finest work, better even than the grander churches he'd built in bigger towns, because he had built it not for wages, but because Coldwater Bend, in those early boom years of silver speculation, had needed somewhere for people to gather and remember what mattered. Marguerite and Thomas never had children of their own, a private sorrow they carried together without ever letting it sour them, and instead they poured themselves into the small congregations they served, into the strangers who passed through needing a meal or a place to sleep, into the slow accumulation of a life built on the same principle Amos Whitlock had taught his daughter, that worth was not appearance, but faithfulness. Thomas grew ill in 1885, a wasting sickness the doctors in Cheyenne could not name, and for 4 years Marguerite nursed him with the same exacting patience her mother had taught her, refusing to believe, until the very end, that his failing body was the whole truth of him. He died in the winter of 1889, in a rented room in Laramie, holding her hand and telling her, with what little breath remained, that she had never once let him believe he was worth less than he was. It was, she would later say, the truest thing anyone had ever told her, and also the beginning of everything that came after. Grief, Marguerite would learn quickly, was a luxury the world did not permit a widow with debts. Thomas had left behind, unknown to her, a series of small loans he had taken out over the years of his illness, money borrowed quietly from her own sister Cordelia, who had married well into a banking family in Cheyenne, and never let Marguerite forget the disparity between their fortunes. Cordelia had lent the money not out of generosity, but it became clear as a kind of investment in leverage, and when Thomas died without having repaid more than a fraction of it, Cordelia arrived at the funeral, not to grieve, but to collect. She stood over her sister in that cold Laramie boarding house, dressed in furs Marguerite could never have afforded, and told her plainly that the debt would be settled through the sale of everything Thomas had owned, his tools, his modest savings, even the small parcel of land he'd purchased years before, with an eye toward retirement. Marguerite did not fight her. She had never had the stomach for fighting Cordelia, who had spent a lifetime turning arguments into wars she always somehow won, and besides, she told herself it was true that the debt was owed. What she had not expected was for Cordelia to go further, to write to the small congregations Marguerite might have turned to for shelter, framing her sister, quietly and effectively, as a woman of poor judgment who could not be trusted with charity, a woman whose husband's sickness had left them both reckless with money. It was a lie constructed from just enough truth to be believable, and it worked exactly as Cordelia intended. Doors that might have opened to a grieving widow closed instead, gently but firmly, and Marguerite understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that she was now entirely alone. She sold what little remained that was legally hers to sell, kept only her mother's sewing shears, her father's woodworking awl, a single photograph of Thomas and the $11 that survived the reckoning, and she bought a mule, an old, limping, sweet-tempered creature named Solomon that no one else wanted because he was the only transportation $11 could still afford after she'd paid for a month's provisions. She rode north and west, without any fixed destination, sleeping in the mule's shadow when no shelter offered itself, taking in mending work in the towns she passed through to earn a few coins toward food. And in this way, 3 months after burying her husband, she came at last to Coldwater Bend, Wyoming, the very town where Thomas had built his finest work 11 years before, though Marguerite herself had not set foot there since, and did not, at first, even recognize where she had arrived. Coldwater Bend in 1889 was a town in slow collapse. The silver strike that had drawn its first settlers had played out a decade earlier, and what remained was a scattering of weathered buildings, a general store kept alive mostly by the ranchers in the surrounding valley, and a population that had thinned from nearly 600 souls to under 200, most of them too old, too poor, or too stubborn to leave. The town's one bank had failed in 1884. Its schoolhouse had closed for lack of a teacher's salary. And at the edge of the main street, past the boarded windows of what had once been a assay office, stood a small white chapel, its paint long since weathered to gray, one window shuttered with warped boards, its steeple leaning at an angle that suggested a strong enough wind might finish what time had started. Marguerite rode past it twice before something in the shape of the door frame, in the particular pitch of the roof line, stopped her breath entirely. She dismounted, walked to the door, and ran her fingers along the wood the way her father had taught her, and she knew, before she even saw the faded carving Thomas had etched into the cornerstone, that this was his church, his finest work, standing, forgotten, and for sale. The sign, nailed crookedly to the door, read simply, "For sale $6. Any buyer." Marguerite learned from the proprietor of the general store, a weathered, kind-eyed woman named Odalis Fenn, that the chapel had been without a congregation for 4 years, ever since the town's last circuit preacher had died, and no replacement could be found willing to serve so diminished a flock. The town council, such as it was, had voted to sell the building simply to be rid of the taxes and upkeep, and had set the price low enough that they assumed someone, anyone, might eventually take it off their hands, if only for the lumber. "Ain't nobody wants it," Odalis told her, not unkindly. "Foundations likely rotted through, roof leaks something terrible, but it's the cheapest roof in the territory, if that's what you're after." Marguerite, standing in the dust of a town she had no history in, as far as anyone there knew, looked at the chapel her husband had built with his own hands, and understood that she was being offered, for $6, the last remaining piece of the life she had lost. She did not tell Odalis who she was, or who Thomas had been to this place. She simply paid the $6 from her tobacco tin, took the key from a startled town clerk who had not expected the sign to ever actually sell anything, and let herself into the chapel alone. For the first time in 11 years, as the last light of a Wyoming evening came slanting gold and low through the one unshuttered window, the inside of the chapel was worse than the outside had suggested, and better than Marguerite had dared hope, both at once. Dust lay thick over the dozen remaining pews, and a family of swallows had built nests in the rafters, but the bones of the place, the joints, the beams, the altar Thomas had carved himself from a single slab of cottonwood, were sound, exactly as sound as she'd known they would be, because Thomas Colcord had never in his life built anything that lied about what it was. She spent that first night sleeping on the altar platform, wrapped in her one blanket, Solomon tethered outside, contentedly cropping the weeds that had grown up through the churchyard, and in the morning she began, out of habit more than plan, to clean. She swept 11 years of dust from the floorboards. She scrubbed the single window until light came through it clean. And on the third day, running her hand along the underside of the altar the way she used to help Thomas sand and finish it decades before. Her fingers found something her eyes had missed entirely, a seam in the wood. Too straight, too deliberate to be an accident of construction, hidden beneath what looked at first like a simple decorative panel. She worked at it for the better part of an hour with her father's old awl before the panel gave way, swinging open on a small brass hinge so cleverly fitted into the grain that even a careful eye would have missed it. Inside was a shallow compartment, dry and untouched by the years, and within it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a small tin box, and a single sealed letter addressed. In handwriting Marguerite would have known anywhere on this earth, to whoever finds this in trust. It was Thomas's hand. Her husband had built a hidden compartment into his own altar 11 years before he died, and had left something inside it that he had never once, in all their years together, mentioned to her. Marguerite sat on the dusty floor of the chapel, with the letter in her trembling hands, for a long while before she found the courage to break the seal. What Thomas had written explained everything and nothing at once. He described how, in the founding years of Coldwater Bend, when the silver strike was still young and the town still flush with hope, the original town council, 5 men whose names Marguerite did not recognize, had entrusted him, as the builder of the only public building most of them trusted, with a portion of the town's founding fund. Money raised from every family in Coldwater Bend, silver miners and ranchers and shopkeepers alike, meant to establish a permanent town charter, a proper schoolhouse, and a fund for the community's poor and elderly, so that Coldwater Bend would never become the kind of town that abandoned its own. But before the fund could be formally transferred to the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, the man managing it, a councilman named Ezra Pruitt, had been discovered embezzling a separate account, and in the panic and suspicion that followed, the council, fearing the entire fund might be seized or stolen before it could be properly secured, had asked Thomas, as a man of unimpeachable honesty and no political stake in the town's factions, to hide the money until a trustworthy arrangement could be made. Thomas had built the hidden compartment for exactly this purpose. But before the arrangement could be finalized, 3 of the 5 councilmen died within a single terrible winter of influenza. The 4th moved east in grief, and the 5th, Ezra Pruitt himself. The very man suspected of theft had somehow talked his way into convincing the surviving town leadership that the fund had never existed at all, that it was a rumor, a myth born of a hard winter and a town's wishful thinking. Thomas, bound by a promise he had made to dead men, and uncertain who among the living could be trusted, had simply waited and waited, until his own health began to fail, and he moved his family on to other work, always intending to return, always believing there would be time enough to make it right. He never had. The letter ended with a single instruction, that whoever found this, and he had prayed, he wrote, that it would someday be discovered by honest hands, was to see the fund finally used for the purpose the town itself had intended, its school, its poor, its future. The tin box, when Marguerite opened it, contained not cash me. 11 years of damp Wyoming winters would have rotted paper currency to nothing but something far more durable, a collection of silver certificates and gold coin, sealed in wax and packed in oiled cotton, along with a handwritten ledger listing every family who had contributed to the fund and how much, down to the last dollar, in Thomas's careful, Cooper's daughter taught penmanship. It was, by Marguerite's rough count, as she sat stunned in the gathering dark, a sum that would have been considerable even in a flourishing town, and in a town as impoverished as Coldwater Bend had become, it was nothing short of a fortune. She understood, sitting there with her husband's 11-year-old secret in her lap, 2 things with total clarity, that this money was not hers, and that she had just been handed, by the man she'd loved and lost, both a sacred trust, and though she did not yet let herself think it plainly, the very thing that could save her own life, as surely as it might save the town's. The following morning, Marguerite went to see the town clerk, a nervous, overworked young man named Silas Whitcomb, who kept what remained of Coldwater Bend's civic records, to ask a careful, roundabout series of questions about the town's history, its founding council, its old silver boom ambitions, whether anyone still living remembered talk of a lost founding fund. Silas laughed, not unkindly, and told her it was an old ghost story parents used to tell children, a tale of buried town money that had never been more than rumor, most people agreed, dreamed up by folks who couldn't accept that the silver had simply run out and taken the town's future with it. But he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was one man in town who still insisted the fund had been real, and who had spent years, in his own quiet way, trying to prove it, the same man, Silas added, with a slight wariness entering his voice, who now held more influence over what remained of Coldwater Bend than anyone else. Councilman Ezra Pruitt, grown old now, but still sharp. Still the man who controlled the last working freight contracts, the general store's supply line, and, as it happened, the deed to nearly a third of the buildings on the town's main street, including, Silas mentioned almost as an afterthought, the very chapel Marguerite had just purchased a technicality of an old lean Pruitt still held from the town's leaner years. One the town clerk hadn't thought to mention, because no one had ever bothered to buy the chapel before. The name struck Marguerite like cold water. Ezra Pruitt, the very man Thomas's letter named as the original suspected thief, the man who had spent 11 years insisting publicly that the fund had never existed, well, apparently, according to Silas's uneasy account, spending those same 11 years quietly buying up the town's most vulnerable properties for pennies on the dollar, positioning himself, brick by brick and lean by lean, to own Coldwater Bend outright the moment its last stubborn residents finally gave up and left. Marguerite began to understand, with a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind, that Ezra Pruitt had not spent 11 years denying the fund's existence out of honest skepticism. He had spent 11 years hoping it would simply rot away in whatever hiding place Thomas had chosen, so that no one would ever be able to prove what he had truly done, or interfere with the slow, patient theft of an entire town he was still committing in plain sight. In the days after finding the letter, before she understood the shape of the danger she had stepped into, Marguerite allowed herself, for the first time in months, a fragile kind of hope, and she spent long evenings by candlelight cross-referencing Thomas's ledger against the town's own surviving records, matching names to faces she was slowly beginning to recognize on Coldwater Bend's quiet streets, the Larkins, who had once run the assay office, and whose granddaughter now clerked at the general store, the Odell family, 3 of whom had died in the same influenza winter that claimed the councilmen, leaving only a nephew who had no notion his family had ever given a cent toward anything. The Fenns, the Whitcombs, the Becks, generation after generation of ordinary, hard-working people who had handed over what they could spare in good faith toward a future they'd been told would never come. The scale of it moved her more than the money itself ever could. This was not a treasure in the way children imagined treasure buried by pirates or outlaws for selfish keeping. It was the pooled faith of an entire vanished era of hopeful people, and Thomas, in hiding it rather than letting it be stolen or scattered, had kept faith with every one of them without ever telling a soul, not even his own wife, what weight he carried. Marguerite understood, reading his letter again by candlelight, why he had never spoken of it, not from secrecy for its own sake, but because he had been waiting for the safest possible moment to set it right. A moment that illness had stolen from him before he could choose it. It became clear to her, in those quiet nights, that finishing what her husband started was no longer a choice she was weighing. It was simply the last thing left for her to do for him, and she intended to do it properly, whatever it cost her. It did not take Ezra Pruitt long to learn that the widow who had bought the derelict chapel was asking pointed questions about the town's founding fund, and it took him even less time to arrive at her door, the chapel's door, which was now, however precariously, hers with an offer dressed up as kindness. He was an old man by then, silver-haired and soft-spoken in the particular way of men who have learned that gentleness is often a more effective weapon than force, and he told Marguerite, standing in the dust of the churchyard, with his hat respectfully in his hands, that he understood the lien on her new property was likely news to her, that such an oversight was regrettable, and that he would be willing, out of Christian charity, to forgive the lien entirely, and even add a modest sum toward her resettlement if she would simply hand over whatever she had found in the old chapel, sight unseen, so that he, as the last surviving founding councilman, could properly and lawfully see it returned to town coffers. Marguerite, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the grain of things and know when a handsome face concealed rot beneath it, told him she would need time to consider so generous an offer. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, and Marguerite understood, watching him ride away, that she had just made herself an enemy of considerable and quiet power. What followed was not open confrontation, but a slow tightening of the noose, familiar to anyone who has watched a powerful man move against someone with nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. Pruitt called in the lien formally within the week, giving Marguerite 30 days to pay a sum she could not possibly raise or vacate the chapel entirely. He let it be known, through channels Marguerite could never quite trace back to him directly, that the widow at the old chapel was not to be trusted, that she'd arrived from nowhere with a story that didn't add up, that decent folk ought to be cautious of a stranger stirring up old rumors about buried town money for her own gain. Odalis Fenn, at the general store, quietly warned Marguerite that credit was being harder to come by for her than it ought to be, that Pruitt's word carried weight enough in Coldwater Bend to make people careful about which side of him they stood on. Marguerite felt, for the first time since Laramie, the particular exhaustion of being disbelieved by people who had no real reason to disbelieve her except that someone more powerful had told them to. There was one evening, deep in that difficult month, when Marguerite came near to despair. A hard rain had found its way through a gap in the chapel's still unrepaired roof, dripping steadily onto the very floorboards she had scrubbed clean her first week in town, and as she set a bucket beneath the leak, she found herself weeping, not for the roof, and not even entirely for Thomas, but for the plain, exhausting unfairness of it, that honesty should require so much defending, that a man like Pruitt could spend a lifetime taking and still hold the town's trust more easily than a widow who had only ever tried to give something back. She thought, in that low hour, of simply paying whatever portion of the lien she could scrape together, handing Pruitt the rest of the fund to be rid of him, and riding on to somewhere no one had ever heard the name Colcord or Whitlock at all. It would have been the easier road, and no one who knew what she'd already survived could have blamed her for taking it. But she thought, too, of her father's rejected oak staves, set aside not because they looked wrong, but because he had taken the time to listen for what lay beneath the surface. And she understood that to hand Pruitt the fund now, simply to escape him, would be to let the flat, hollow lie he'd told for 11 years finally ring true. She dried her eyes, moved the bucket, and returned the next morning to the ledger and to the doors of Coldwater Bend's remaining families with the same patience her mother had shown over a lifetime of unpicked stitches. But Marguerite Colcord had learned patience from a seamstress mother who unpicked an hour's careless stitching without complaint, and she had learned from a Cooper father that the truth of a thing eventually shows itself to anyone patient enough to look past its surface. She did not confront Pruitt. Instead, she went, quietly and methodically, to every family whose name appeared in Thomas's careful ledger, the descendants, where the original contributors had passed, of the silver miners and shopkeepers and ranch families who had given toward Coldwater Bend's founding fund 11 years before, and she showed them, one household at a time, the exact figure their family had once contributed, in her dead husband's own handwriting, dated and witnessed. She did not ask them for anything. She simply let them see the truth Pruitt had spent 11 years telling them did not exist. And she found, as she went, that Silas Whitcomb was not the only one who remembered that old Hiram Beck who ran what remained of the livery, recalled his father's fury the winter the fund disappeared, and that Odalis Fenn herself had contributed $4 as a young bride. Money she'd always secretly believed had simply been stolen and never spoken of, because speaking of it had seemed, for 11 long years, entirely pointless. By the time Pruitt's 30-day deadline arrived, Marguerite had done something he had not accounted for in all his years of careful, patient theft. She had made the town remember itself. She called a public meeting in the one building still capable of holding the town's dwindling population comfortably, fittingly, her own chapel, its dust swept, its window washed, its pews wiped clean for the first time in over a decade, and she stood at the altar her husband had built and told Coldwater Bend the truth, plainly and without embellishment, that the founding fund had been real, that Thomas Colcord had hidden it to protect it, that it had sat safe and untouched for 11 years exactly as he'd left it, and that the man who had spent those 11 years convincing them it never existed was the very man who had first been suspected of trying to steal it. She produced the ledger. She produced the letter, reading Thomas's own words aloud, in a voice that did not waver even once, though her hands trembled the entire time. And she watched Ezra Pruitt, standing near the back of his own former church, go the color of ash as 40 years of careful reputation collapsed in the space of 20 minutes, under the plain weight of a dead carpenter's honest handwriting. Pruitt tried, in the days that followed, everything a cornered man of his sort typically tries. He threatened legal action he could not actually afford to pursue once the town's sympathy had turned so decisively against him. He attempted, briefly and unsuccessfully, to claim the fund as his own rightful property by virtue of his old council position. He even tried, in a final act of petty spite, to force the lien on the chapel regardless, until Hiram Beck and 3 other ranchers made it clear, in terms that required no further clarification, that Pruitt's freight contracts and supply lines would find no cooperation from Coldwater Bend's remaining businesses if he pursued it. Within a month, faced with a town that had finally, collectively, remembered what it knew, Ezra Pruitt quietly sold his remaining holdings in Coldwater Bend and left for California, and no one troubled themselves overmuch to wish him well on the journey. He did not go to prison. There was, in truth, no court in the territory eager to prosecute an old man for a theft 11 years past that he had ultimately failed to complete, but he left, having lost the one thing men like him valued above money, which was the respect of a town he had spent decades quietly trying to own. What Marguerite did next was, to her, never really a question at all, though it surprised everyone who did not yet understand what kind of woman she was. She did not keep the fund for herself, though every dollar of the lien Pruitt had placed against her chapel could easily have been settled from it, and though she had, by any fair accounting, more right to some portion of it than most, given all she had personally sacrificed to see it safely delivered. Instead, she gathered the town council that remained, Silas Whitcomb, Odalis Fenn, Hiram Beck, and 2 ranchers elected on the spot by the assembled townsfolk, and together they used Thomas's fund exactly as it had always been intended. They reopened the schoolhouse, hiring a young teacher from Cheyenne with the first year's salary guaranteed. They established, formally and permanently this time, a fund for Coldwater Bend's elderly and infirm, naming it, over Marguerite's own quiet objection, the Colcord Trust, and they repaired the chapel roof, the leaning steeple, the rotted boards Odalis had warned her about on that very first day, restoring it not as Marguerite's private property, but as what it had always truly been, a gathering place belonging to the whole of Coldwater Bend. Marguerite herself asked for nothing beyond what she had already paid, the deed to the chapel itself, free and clear of any lien, and the modest right to live in the small room behind the altar that had once served as Thomas's study, tending the building her husband had built and the secret he had guarded with his life's quiet integrity. She was 41 years old, and she had once arrived in Coldwater Bend with $11, a limping mule, and a name her own sister had tried to erase. She had bought, for $6, a building the entire town had written off as worthless, and inside it she had found not merely her husband's hidden fortune, but the proof of exactly the values he had spent his whole life quietly living by, that a thing's worth is never what it appears to be to a careless glance, that patience outlasts theft, and that honesty, buried long enough, still eventually finds its way into honest hands. Marguerite Colcord rode into Coldwater Bend with nothing anyone there could see was worth having, and she left, not by leaving at all, but by staying, with everything that had ever truly mattered, a purpose, a community that had come, slowly and rightfully, to trust her, and the quiet, settled knowledge that she had finished the last and finest work her husband ever began. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Marguerite's story tonight. If a tale of overlooked worth and quiet justice moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that value isn't always visible at first glance. And we'd love to know, what is a time you found something worth keeping in a place or a person that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.